Hi, my name is Laura Sarchet, and I am the Inclusive Higher Education GA at the University of Rochester. Today we are talking about ZPD, or Zone of Proximal Development, and this is a way of thinking about challenge and scaffolding to support our students. As a reminder, for a little bit of context, you may have students from the tour program who are BOCES students with intellectual and developmental disabilities auditing classes at the University of Rochester in your class. You may have students registered with the Office of Disability Resources who need accommodations, and you also may have neurodiverse and neurotypical students who benefit from these instructional strategies. The objective for today is that you will develop your understanding of the zone of proximal development in order to promote student learning and independence and identify one action step towards being a more inclusive educator. So, what is zone of proximal development? The zone of proximal development is the area between what a student can do independently and what they can't do at all, even with support. So in this diagram, you'll see the green circle is where the learner is right now. This is what they can do on their own. And then the white outer circle is what they cannot do. Then the zone of proximal development is highlighted in yellow, and it is in the middle. And this is a place where we can move the student from what they already know how to do into what they can't do by providing them with a little bit of support. So in this zone of proximal development, we are providing supports for activities that students can do with support, and eventually we can fade those supports so that they can do those activities independently. And this is where the most learning occurs, when we are teaching students in their zone of proximal development. So when students are in their zone of proximal development and your activities are targeted towards what is appropriate for the student's zone of proximal development, they are going to be active, they're going to be excited and challenged appropriately and willing to take risks, which is very important for their learning. If our teaching is targeted towards what the students can already do, and this is too easy for them, they might be comfortable, bored, it might feel too safe, and not as much learning is occurring. That's not to say that we can't teach in this area. It's just knowing that this is an area where we can review and then move towards the student's zone of proximal development. However, if we challenge students too much with activities and tasks that are difficult for them to the point of where they are extremely difficult and they can't do even with supports, then students become stressed, anxious, disengaged, maybe fearful of learning and fearful of the classroom. So there's not as much learning happening there. But when we are working with students in their zone of proximal development, eventually what is in the zone of proximal development, the students eventually learn how to do independently, and their zone of proximal development shifts to what they previously couldn't do. Now they're going to be able to do with support, and their learning and development is going to be growing even more when we provide support in that area. So this is a really fluid thing. It shifts as the student's learning and development grows, supported by us as instructors. So some examples of scaffolding, and scaffolding is just a way that we move students through the zone of proximal development by supporting them. So one example is the I do, we do, you do method. And this is where we model and think aloud, telling the students what we're thinking as we go through a task or process, such as modeling a math problem on the board and saying out loud every thought that goes through your head as you are solving the problem that helps you solve the problem. Then guided practice is where students work together with the instructor and each other to work through a problem or the task that has already been modeled for them, but this time they're taking a little bit more leadership in that task. Then finally, after we've done instruction through modeling and guided practice, then we can have the students work on the activity on their own. So this is where they might take practice home for homework or do something independently in the classroom or work on it without the instructor's support. And the idea is that we're kind of fading away that support as the students learn more about the task or skill. Explicit instruction is really important for scaffolding, and showing and doing exactly what the students will have to do as well. So that's a way to support students in their zone of proximal development. Chunking or breaking assignments or tasks down into steps is really helpful. And we want to try to provide the least support needed. So if a student doesn't need support with something, it's promoting their independence by letting them do the activity on their own. If they do need support, that's okay. But we want to kind of think about where we can push the students a little bit with their challenge, with the challenge that's appropriate in their zone of proximal development, with scaffolding, but not too much scaffolding so that they feel like this is too easy, or they feel like their independence is being pushed back against. Another way of scaffolding is by using prompts. And I want to show kind of a variety of prompts that can be used in the classroom to support students. So on the bottom, we have more intrusive types of prompts, and this is when a student needs a lot of practice with something. So for example, or a lot of support with something. So for example, if you're working with someone who needs support with drawing a new symbol that they just learned in math, they might have to have you kind of take their hand and draw the symbol together, hand over hand, with full physical guidance. Maybe next time then you can move to a less intrusive support where you're just modeling and then they can do it themselves afterwards. Direct verbal, partial verbal, or indirect verbal is just a varying way of telling the student what to do. Again, if the student needs more support, we want to tell them exactly what to do, be very direct and explicit. Or if we think that they have a little bit more independence with this particular task, we can just question, well, what do you do next? That's an indirect verbal. Even just pausing before the student is supposed to do something can indicate that they need to initiate a task, and that's a way to prompt as well. So again, all students might not need all of these varieties of prompts, and it really depends on the particular task. So if a student needs modeling or even partial physical guidance in one particular activity or task, they might not need that in another task. They might only need an expectant pause, or they may be completely independent with a different academic task. So we want to really think about that. And I want to just highlight some reasons that students may become dependent on prompts. And we want to try to kind of avoid this, again, to promote independence for our students. So relying on a single instructor sometimes lends students to become more prompt dependent. So for example, if a student is in your class and they have a coach with them, both the instructor and the coach should be providing prompts so that the student is not just relying on their coach. An overuse of prompts when they're not needed, helping too much or too soon, failure to fade prompts. So if a student needs you to gesture towards what they're supposed to do, maybe next time try doing a verbal prompt instead of a gestural prompt, to again promote that independence and kind of move the student towards doing something independent that they once needed support for through that zone of proximal development. And then lastly is just the repeated use of the prompt hierarchy across all environments. So again, this is what I mentioned before about if a student needs more intrusive prompts in one area or one environment or one particular task or activity, they might not need that much prompting for a different activity or task. So cater your prompting towards the specific task and the specific student, not just assuming that because a student needs a lot of support in one area, they will also need a lot of support in another area. So after all this information about zone of proximal development, I'd like you to think about one activity you're doing in class this week. Does this fit with your students' zone of proximal development? Or is it too easy, or is it too difficult? Does it need to be scaffolded to fit better into the zone of proximal development so that the students can achieve some success? Other options for future action steps for you are to view another resource on our YouTube channel or reach out to me with professional development. I also love to hear what you're doing in your classroom, so please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I can be reached at ihega@rochester.edu. Thank you.